Thank you very much. What a great place this is. Thank you all for coming. I have been at work on this book for a long time. I actually got the idea in 1973 because that was the anniversary year, the 500th anniversary of Copernicus's birth. And I read an article about his life and about how he had actually come up with his idea as a young man, but then was working on it but afraid to make it public. And as he developed it over the course of his life, he got more and more hesitant about going public until he was in his late 60s, and a young genius came to visit him and talked him into letting his work see the light of day. And I remember thinking, that must have been some conversation. What could have changed his mind after all that time? And the more I looked at it, the more interesting it got, because the visitor came to Catholic Poland, where Copernicus lived, from the Lutheran part of Germany, from Martin Luther's own university. And Lutherans had been banished from Copernicus's part of Poland. And somehow he managed to stay for 2 years and help Copernicus prepare the book. That was a great Latin pronunciation we had of On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, and actually took the manuscript to Nuremberg, where it was printed. So to start tonight, I'd like to show you some images from parts of my research. I did write a play eventually. It was a complete departure from anything I'd ever done before. When I showed one of the early drafts to a real director, he said to me, "You've written a book. It looks like a play on the page with lots of white space and characters speaking, but everyone talks in complete sentences. Everything follows logically. People don't talk that way. Even 500 years ago, they didn't talk that way." And so I've been through many rewritings over the years, and now I feel the middle part really is a play. But at the beginning, when I was just trying to find out about Copernicus, I visited his hometown, his birthplace in Poland, Torun, and this wonderful painting of him is there, and the lady next to it is the curator of the museum of his house, the house where his family lived. And is it just me, or does she look exactly like him? I don't know. The hair certainly helps, but she's identified with him to such an extent that she actually looks like him. I also had help, wonderful help in Poland. Here are my two favorite men in Poland. I met this young mining engineer on an eclipse trip, and I told him in conversation that I was about to start a project about Copernicus and I was going to Poland, and he said, "Well, you must tell me the dates of your trip, and I will get the time off work and serve as your translator and guide," which he did. And I really could not have managed without his help, because the places I visited, really nobody spoke English. So it was great to have him. This is the title page of the famous book. About 600 copies of 16th century editions of it survive to the present day. So you might be able to see one in a library. I'm pretty sure there's one here at the college. A first edition? A second edition, just as good almost, because the second edition was also still in the 16th century. So it was a big, important book, and so many copies have survived, and occasionally they come up for sale at auction. Occasionally one gets stolen because it's so valuable, and someone tries to sell it on the black market, but it's very difficult to unload a stolen copy of Copernicus's book. So buyer beware. And would probably cost you over €1 million. So that was the going price last time one sold. So Copernicus is famous for having put the sun at the center of the planet's orbits, removing the Earth from the center. He was not the first one to come up with that idea, but he was certainly the first to create a completely formulated system about how all the planets would work if the Earth and Sun changed places. He did not set out to do that. His interest in the planets started when he was a university student. He made observations. He studied tables. Astrologers needed to know the positions of the planets to cast horoscopes and make various predictions. It's not clear that he was ever at all interested in astrology, but he became very interested in the movements of the planets. And when he was a law student in Bologna, he roomed with the local astronomer and assisted him in observations. So he developed an interest in both aspects of astronomy. And originally what bothered him was that the reigning authorities had the planets moving in ways that weren't really perfect circles at uniform speeds. And this really bothered him because he felt that the main thought in astronomy, the guiding idea, was that heavenly bodies moved with uniform motion in perfect circles. This same problem had bothered several Islamic astronomers who solved the problem without making the Earth and Sun trade places. It seems as though Copernicus was aware of their work, even lifted some of their ideas, but then went on to do this other innovation and reorganize what we now call the solar system. This is the area where he lived. It's a very rural part of Poland. It's in the far north, on a bay. So the Vistula River empties into this bay and then on into the ocean. And the complex where he lived as an administrator of the Catholic Church, one enters today through this broad walk. And inside is the church where he had his altar. He was a canon, was one of 16 cathedral canons. So he had many jobs. He was a medical doctor, so he was the personal physician to the bishop and to the other canons. And he had his own altar in the church, although he was not an ordained priest and could not celebrate Mass himself. And in this cathedral, which was the foundations were laid in the 14th century, are many beautiful pieces of artwork. This is part of a triptych that has, like the exhibit here, has some real gold in it to celebrate the Passion. And in the wall surrounding the cathedral and the other buildings, Copernicus had a tower. And he could live in this tower. He could go to it in dangerous times. There was constant warfare. The town where he lived was invaded by the Knights of the Teutonic Order frequently. They set fire to the village a time or two, and most of the canons had a house outside the walls, but also a place they could go for safety. And he had various scientific instruments that he could use, nothing like a telescope that would magnify the heavens, but instruments such as an astrolabe that could help him measure the positions of the planets against the background stars or with reference to the horizon. This is a famous painting of him from the 19th century by Jan Matejko, And some of the instruments are on display here. Let's see if I can use this as a pointer. This is his triquetrum, and there's a model of it at his university in Krakow that I was able to photograph. And again, this is just something that helps you carefully measure the altitude of a heavenly body above the horizon. In this statue, there's statues of him all over Poland doing various things, and he's holding a small armillary sphere, which would allow him to think about positions of the planets, and would have had the Earth at the center. Here's another armillary sphere in this imagined view of Copernicus drawing his famous diagram of the reorganized positions. And as I mentioned, he was a medical doctor, and at the time, astrologers really were important in the practice of medicine, although it's not clear that he based his medicine on astrology. But the various parts of the body were considered to be governed by different signs. So it was important to know your patient's horoscope to determine what treatment to prescribe and also when to administer the treatment. These are actual cannonballs from a basement room of one of the castles where he lived. His uncle was the bishop. That's how he became a canon. He and his brother both were canons by political appointment. And he found himself sometimes actually in charge of the physical defense of the cathedral chapter's headquarters. Not something I thought of him doing when I had my early images of Copernicus. And he also, for 3 years at a time, was in charge of administering the lands that the church owned and that it leased to peasants who worked the land and then had to give up most of what they raised on the land to the church. And they also paid rent to the church for the privilege of working on the land. And it was his job to collect those rents and to supervise any exchanges of parcels of land. And this image is from a book of hours that just shows the different kinds of work done at different times of year. But he was involved in that too. He did not have a full-time career as an astronomer. When he was in that job, he lived in this castle. All these castles had been built by the Knights of the Teutonic Order, but then as they lost various wars with Poland, they were driven east, and the Polish kingdom took over their palaces. And so he lived in this one. And at that time, he was trying to figure out the true length of the year. And so he was plotting the course of the sun over the year on a special sundial that he built in an open loggia of that palace. He was also involved as an economic advisor to the King of Poland, trying to improve the value of the currency. And these are some of the coins that were popular in his time. There were numerous mints, and sometimes the mint would just issue new money that had a lower content of silver, but the same face value. So of course people would hoard the coins that had more silver and just spend the other ones. And he came up with this idea that bad money drives good money out of circulation, which is now known as Gresham's Law, for Sir Thomas Gresham, who had the same idea in a different country. And it's certainly true. So Copernicus was able to convince the king that when a new currency is issued, you have to demand that you have to buy back all the old currency. And you'll lose a little money doing that at first, but save yourself grief in the long run. And here is another artist imagining of Copernicus delivering his treatise on money to the Senate in Poland. And nowadays, we remember him in various ways. There was a satellite launched in the 1970s that was named Copernicus Orbiting Astronomical Observatory. And there is a crater named for him on the moon. And recently, although I think it might have been too recent to work itself into the exhibit here, but an element has been named Copernicium in his honor. And the young man who came to him and convinced him to publish somehow lived an entire lifetime, published numerous books without ever having any image painted of him. He's the only person in the Copernicus story, the only male anyway, for whom there is no sense of what he looked like. So you'll just have to use your own imaginings about that. And I've run through my pictures, so I'll ask you to come join me and we can have our conversation. Should I close this or leave that up on there?
Leave it as it is.
Okay, so there's Tycho crater, and I guess you can all read. Thank you.
Thank you.
I suppose I'm curious just to come back a little bit to the achievement for which he's most famous, for his astronomical achievement. I guess one thing that I was wondering was, how difficult was it for people to really come to terms with this idea? In 1543, when his book was published, how counterintuitive, how shocking, how disruptive was this idea that the Earth might in fact be in motion?
I think it's very hard for people to appreciate that now because we are all taught from an early age that the Earth is in motion. But if you think about it, there's no way you can tell as an inhabitant of the Earth that it's moving. You can tell the Earth is round, but you cannot tell that it's in motion. So the prevailing common wisdom, the entire astronomical establishment, everyone believed that the Earth was central and everything else moved around us. And also the Bible made reference to that fact, that the Earth had been set on its foundation, not to be moved forever. So to go against all of that was a very dangerous position to take, and people didn't fully accept it till the middle of the 19th century.
And of course, later on with Galileo, Copernicus's book went on the index of prohibited books, and and then Galileo himself had to recant the Copernican theory. But I guess that was a long time later. That was,
right.
In Copernicus's time, do you think that he was fearful that this might be regarded as a heretical idea, that the Earth moved?
I think he was very afraid of
as a churchman?
What the reaction might be. And he says in his dedication letter, he dedicated the book to the Pope, a politic move. And he says in his letter, his dedication letter to the Pope, that there may be babblers who will take biblical quotations and twist them to their purpose to condemn me. So he was definitely afraid of that. But he did not feel he was doing anything irreligious. But he knew that was the threat. And also he was afraid people would laugh at him, because it certainly seemed ridiculous to think that the Earth was moving, because the speed is tremendous. I mean, it isn't just moving a little bit. It's moving, it's spinning, it has to spin around at 1,000 miles an hour. So that's a lot to swallow if you are convinced that it doesn't move at all. And then it has to move through space almost 100 times faster.
And I suppose one thing that was interesting in your book is you talk about the...
Only one thing?
Sorry. one of many things. Well, the Osiander, this anonymous preface that was inserted into Copernicus's book, which kind of took the sting out of the theory in a way by suggesting that, in fact, the purpose of astronomers was not to actually teach you the truth about the causes of how things work, but in fact it was just a calculating technique. So was that a kind of a popular view at the time, that in fact, this was just a calculating device rather than a real idea about the Earth?
Well, the role of astronomers was to calculate positions, and it was the role of natural philosophers to try to think about the way things really worked.
Yeah.
And nobody thought you could know how the heavens worked unless you experienced a divine revelation. But when Copernicus reorganized the planets, something incredible happened, which was that the speeds of the planets suddenly made sense. No one had ever understood before why they would move at different speeds. But now he had an explanation. What is closest to the sun moves fastest, and the farthest planet from the sun moves slowest. And he didn't know why that was, but there was something about a force from the sun that was influencing the planets, and that convinced him that he had the real goods, that this was not just a calculating tool, but this was God's plan.
So that he discovered an ordering where the speeds of the planets were naturally arranged.
Yes, once you put the sun at the center and the Earth between Venus and Mars, all the speeds line up in order. And that is impressive. And so he came to feel that it was not just a calculating technique, but that he knew the order of the planets. And he corresponded with the person you mentioned, Osiander, who had been a Catholic priest, converted to become a Lutheran, but was also very knowledgeable about astronomy. And Copernicus wrote to him about his project. And the letter from Osiander survives, and it says, don't present this as a real explanation. Make it gentler. Tell people you've figured out another way to do calculations, and later they'll be able to accept it better. But Copernicus did not want to do that. As things happened, when the book was being printed, the young visiting genius couldn't see it all the way through proofreading and turned over that job to Osiander, who inserted an anonymous preface that said, this is basically for calculation, and if you expect anything real from astronomy, you will leave this subject a bigger fool than when you entered it. So that kept people from thinking it was a serious statement. And some people believed Copernicus, despite the anonymous prep. People like Kepler felt he was certainly telling what he believed to be true. And then when Galileo perfected the telescope enough to be able to discover the moons of Jupiter and could show that there were bodies in orbit around something other than the Earth, he also came forward and supported Copernicus. He'd been afraid to before that. But that convinced him, and then he began speaking publicly in Italian, and that got the authorities very upset. And it was only then that Copernicus's book went on to the index.
And you showed in your slides, you showed some pictures of astronomical instruments like an astrolabe and a device for measuring the altitude of the planets. But my kind of preconception about Copernicus was, people say that he never really did that many observations, and
that was
is that
what
true?
I was told too,
or did he actually do a lot?
He actually did. Most of what he did was mathematical. Certainly, the book reads like a textbook in spherical trigonometry, trigonometry and spherical geometry. So it's not light reading. But then he made observations to corroborate his ideas. And several of them are listed in the book. He mentions, I saw this on such and such a date. And he also owned books by other astronomers that predicted when eclipses would occur, and he made his own notes in those books about his observations.
Do you think the observations were a key driver for him?
No.
Or was it more about aesthetics?
Yeah, I think it was the aesthetics, the beauty and simplicity of the system, and the fact that it now gave you a way to gauge distances and positions. I mean, people really had no idea. They knew the moon had to be close because it was moving fast and it was big, and the sun had to be pretty close. But where was Mercury? Was it between the moon and the sun, or was it beyond the sun? Where was Venus? That was really not known, and there were different schools of thought about where at least those two planets were. And so you had to have a different way of calculating the inferior planets, namely Mercury and Venus, from the superior planets, the ones that were beyond the Earth.
Well, we're going to open it up in a little while to the floor, but before we do that, I'd just like to kind of ask you a little bit about the this interesting context of, you've got the Reformation in full swing, you've got Martin Luther and Melanchthon over in Wittenberg, and that kind of plays a really important part in your story. And there's this wonderful quote attributed to Luther, which you include in the book, which is something that Luther is supposed to have said before the Copernicus's book came out, where he says, "So goes it now. Whoever wants to be clever must agree with nothing that others esteem. He must do something of his own. This is what that fellow does who wishes to turn the whole of astronomy upside down. Even in these things that are thrown into disorder, I believe the Holy Scriptures, for Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth." So it's amazing that Luther himself was kind of ridiculing the Copernican theory even before the book came out. And tell me a bit more about what was going on there. And then you have, of course, Rheticus, who comes and visits Copernicus in this amazing moment that you capture in the play. So how does the whole Reformation context play into this episode?
Well, Luther and Melanchthon had very different ideas about astrology. So Luther did not believe in astrology. He called it the devil's work and didn't pay any attention to it. Everyone thought that the idea of the earth in motion was insane. And in fact, when the book came out, the scholars who were working at Luther's university in Wittenberg didn't pay attention to the opening sections of the book that explain that the earth should actually be moving around the sun. They just went right past that part and straight to the mathematics and diagrams and tables, and that's what they accepted. Where the Reformation played the most interesting role for me was the fact that this visitor would come from that world into Copernicus's Catholic world, where his presence was proscribed, but the interest in the subject was enough to overcome any hesitation he might have had. And he took the book back to Germany, to Nuremberg, where scientific printing was at an advanced state. And he was personally acquainted with a printer who was able to take on a project like this. There was no printer in Poland at that time who could have published this book.
That's an amazing episode. And the character in your book of Rheticus, the young Lutheran who courageously, or almost in a foolhardy way, shows up on Copernicus's doorstep, is an amazing figure. And I suppose one of the things that amazed me was, I might have expected a book about Copernicus. He's a canon of the church and an astronomer. You might expect it to be quite dry reading, but far from it. It's positively racy, particularly in the play. It's the play Copernicus is involved with his housekeeper, and Rheticus is actually having an affair. I don't want to give too much away,
don't give too much away.
But there's all sorts of shenanigans going on.
There definitely, but there are always shenanigans in a human life. Copernicus really did have a female housekeeper, and in the scant historical record, there are only 17 letters that survive that tell anything about Copernicus, and 3 of them are about the housekeeper, because the bishop was really unhappy that he had this woman living in his house. And there were several other canons who also had housekeepers, and all of them were pressured repeatedly to get rid of them. One of the canons had several children with his housekeeper. So in the play part of the book, I felt that I was safe to call them lovers. But that's why when I started this project, it was supposed to be only a play. And it was very hard for me, aside from the problems of learning about playwriting, but just to let the characters be dramatic, because I was always worried about what Copernicus would think if I made him too different from the way he really was. And, I'm trained as a reporter. I don't usually make things up. So I was hesitant. And the plays, the early drafts, were quite boring. And then, but I persevered, and I was also collecting material all the time to support the information in the play. Everything I read as research or background, I thought it'd be great if I put a package together, and if I ever got the play performed, say at a university, this would make a great interdisciplinary project. There could be students in history involved, astronomy. And so I told this to my publisher, and he said, well, you should write that book. You should take all of that information, tell the story up to the time of the play, then have the play, and then pick up the story and bring it to the present day. And that, I thought, was a brilliant idea, rather than just publish the play as a freestanding item. So now we have this unusual hybrid. Telling the real story freed me to have the characters more interesting in the play, but all of that is based on something that really happened. Later, Rheticus was formally charged with sodomy and dismissed from his teaching position later in his life. So there was evidence there for some shenanigans.
And it is very interesting for me, the structure of the book, that it is sort of a sandwich with the play in the middle. And this was your first foray into fiction, was it not?
Yes.
Yeah. And what was that like for you?
It was horrible at first. It was so much more difficult than I ever expected. And at the beginning I thought, well, this has to be a play. It can't sound like a history lesson or an astronomy lecture. But then it did. And took many rewrites to get that out of there.
And I suppose, there's so many wonderful science-related plays, like there's everything from Brecht's Life of Galileo.
Well, I don't think that's a wonderful play.
You don't?
No.
You hate it? Oh, really?
Because I think it paints a bad picture of him. They make him look like an awful person.
Maybe, yeah. There's 2 endings, right? There's 2 different.
Right.
But I guess you've also got Copenhagen.
Yes, now that's a great play.
And
so every day I woke up.
Interest to you when you were kind of thinking about how you might go about this?
Great interest, and I often thought if Michael Frayn had known this story, he would have taken it himself, or Tom Stoppard.
Great.
So,
and, we could talk for hours, but I'd like now to open it up to the floor, because I'm sure people have questions. So, yes, right here in the front. And sorry, if you wouldn't mind just waiting for the microphone, there's 2 people with microphones here who will bring them down to you. Thanks. Just over here.
Hello. I enjoyed Galileo's Daughter very much, and Letters to Father, and I haven't read your new book yet, but you're a very descriptive writer, and I think maybe, I don't know whether it's being considered that maybe some small movies or documentaries could walk out of your books.
That would be nice. There actually was a television docudrama made of Galileo's daughter. And I'm not sure if it was shown here. It was made by Nova, which is the American version of Horizon. And it was a 2-hour production. It was called Galileo's Battle for the Heavens. And Longitude was actually made into a 1-hour docudrama, but then a 3-hour movie. And it was such a short book, that they... and the movie was good. Jeremy Irons and Michael Gambon were in it. So that's been a thrill. I never expected that to happen.
Are we going to see Copernicus, the movie?
I don't know. I'm still working on getting the play somewhere.
Any more questions? Yeah, at the back there, there's a couple of hands. Yeah, one over there and then one there.
All the way up here. Hi. I just wanted to ask you mentioned yourself that you started off journalism and then you moved into writing books. And I was just wondering, because when I read your books, they're wonderful because they're part science textbook, part stories about the actual scientists themselves. I was wondering, where did you get your voice from and what science writers do you admire yourself?
Science writers that I admire. This is always a tricky question for me because so many of my friends are science writers. But I was a great fan of John McPhee, Jonathan Weiner, Beak of the Finch. I like Diane Ackerman. She's a very good friend. Casey Cole. But for my voice, I think what helps me most is to think of somebody I'm telling the story to, somebody who would be really interested in that story. And that helps, because it's a different person every time.
And just behind, yeah. And then over here.
Many years ago, the Irish novelist John Banville wrote a novel about Copernicus. Gloomy novel. Mind you, all Banville's books are gloomy. I wonder if you came across it or if it influenced your take on Copernicus.
I certainly did come across it. I read it. I quoted a little bit of it in the first chapter of the book, but it is gloomy. The book about Kepler was not as gloomy. He wrote a novel about Kepler, too. But Dr. Copernicus, I found very dark, but I liked it. And I was struck by his interest in astronomy and why he would take on those characters. He has such breadth in his choice of subjects. I'm definitely a fan.
Copernicus' book is called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. So, there was the view that the planets moved around on crystalline spheres. And it seems that to some extent he was still within that sort of view, although you talked about the force from the sun.
His use of the words circles and spheres and orbs, historians are arguing about that all the time. Did he really imagine that the other worlds were embedded in solid structures that moved sphere within sphere? And certainly he draws their paths that way. But how he actually envisioned the heavens is open to discussion. And as I said, it is heatedly discussed. But he felt that whatever motion was made, that a planet made 3 or 4 motions, that it might spin, it might wobble on its axis, and then it would also go around the sun. It would do all those things, and he would calculate all of those motions together.
More questions? Yes. That's my mother.
I was going to say she's wearing a
I
ring.
think everybody heard that. I was just wondering, when you mentioned about him borrowing from the Islamist scholars, to what level did he borrow? To what level had they also done the same research beforehand, and in what period did that happen?
Yeah, centuries before him, 11th, 12th, 13th century, they were very troubled by any compromise of perfect circles. And they came up with a way to combine motions. I don't think I can explain it with my hands, but they definitely came up with a way of having circles move within circles that would reproduce what they observed the planets doing without changing the order of the planets. And they drew diagrams of this method of moving. And those diagrams are exactly like some of Copernicus's diagrams, down to the lettering, so that scholars have made the case that he must have seen a manuscript. He probably did. But it was not, people didn't give credit at that time to other scientists. And possibly working for the church, he would not have been able to credit someone who was of another religion. He certainly doesn't mention Rheticus by name as someone who helped him. So I think it's true that he did see that other work. I think it's too much of a coincidence that he came up with exactly the same thing himself. But again, that innovation did not inspire his Islamic predecessors to reorganize the planets and to put the sun in motion.
More questions? Yes, at the front. Yeah.
Sorry, I've two questions, and I don't know if I expect an answer to the second. Copernicus' book with somebody else's preface and Max Planck's 1900 paper on entropy both start with an apology saying, this is not meant to be science, this is how to do measurement. Are they pretty much unique in that as amongst important papers? And the second question is, does anyone else except me see a similarity between Claudius Ptolemy's epicycles, which are complex, difficult to manage, and wrong, and string theory?
Well, I don't know. That would be my answer to both your questions. We could take a vote about string theory and Ptolemy's circles, but I don't know of other papers that start off saying this is just a way of calculating.
I think that there is a long-standing tradition, though, of what's called to save the phenomena. The idea that astronomy and the mathematical arts did not tell you the truth about the cosmos, but they just told you they were just techniques for what they called saving the phenomena. So the Osiander is kind of drawing on a long tradition there, isn't he?
Yes,
yeah.
that your calculations will reproduce what you see in the sky, whether or not that's how it actually works.
And just on the epicycles and string theory, Copernicus, he still had epicycles, right? He got rid of the equant. Wasn't that the thing that was the... But not the...
Okay, you brought up the word, you explain it.
Sorry. The equant.
Yes.
Do I have to explain the equant now?
Yeah, or not.
Okay, my understanding of the equant is it a point from which the speeds appear to be the same?
Right.
Right.
But
So
it's an off-center axis.
Yes, yeah.
So how does a sphere revolve around an off-center axis?
Right.
That was what bothered Copernicus, and that's why he got rid of that thing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Any more questions or critiques of string theory? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, given that we know so much about his work, how easy was it to kind of come to grips with him as a person? And did your view of him, given that you had such a long gestation for this, and for other reasons I'm really pleased to hear that, did you find your view of him and the story changed over the 30-odd years that it took to bring this to fruit?
Yes. That was the answer to the second question. I just would like to say that there's a lot known about his work because he published this very big book, but he never says how he came up with the idea, why he was convinced that it was right. he leaves an awful lot unsaid. And so you just have to draw your own conclusions from it. And my view of him definitely changed. I think from things I had learned, one of the early books I read was The Sleepwalkers by Arthur Koestler, and Koestler really didn't like Copernicus. So I had a sense of him as kind of a fearful person who didn't have the courage of his own convictions. But the more I read, the less I felt that was true, because he was so bold about stating his case in a number of areas, medically, economically, and in astronomy. But for the play, I liked to think of him as a little complex, that he could perhaps be a failure in his personal relations. And I think we all know people like that who are very confident in their work, but they don't relate well to others, or they do, and they cannot make the other person as much of a priority as perhaps the other people in their lives, as much of a priority as perhaps they should. So that was interesting to me. But there's no evidence one way or the other about what he was like as a person. Rheticus later in life recalls him as a very kind man, a wonderful, brilliant teacher, but it doesn't really tell you much. Do we have another question? I mean, one thing that I found very interesting is this whole question of the size of the universe, and that the universe suddenly got a lot bigger. Do you want to just say a little bit about that? Another problem with Copernicus's design was, okay, if we agree that we're in motion and we're moving around the sun every year, shouldn't we see some kind of change in the stars? Wouldn't the stars look maybe closer together when they're farther away from us, and when we got closer to them, they would appear farther apart? There should be something that we notice. And he said, we should notice that. And the fact that we don't only proves that the stars are much farther away than anybody thought. In fact, they're so far away that the distance between the Earth and the sun comes down to a point in comparison to the distance from the Earth to the stars. And that was really too much for most people to accept. That. And some of his successors rejected his theory for that reason.
Do we have one final question? Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to mention that if any of you are interested in becoming the proud owners of a signed copy of A More Perfect Heaven, Dava Sobel has very kindly agreed to sign some copies, so we have them. If you'd like to just come to the front at the end, you can get your copy signed. And then it just remains to thank you all, and to thank someone who really has an extraordinary art of turning science into story, Dava Sobel. Thank you.